Well, we're waiting now for Prime Minister's questions at noon here on All Out Politics. Likely to be a number of questions, of course, about David Cameron's lobbying activities and the way that allegations certainly seem to be spreading into the ranks of the government and the civil service, but many other important matters, not least the pandemic, on the mind of MPs. We're going to be joined by a panel. With us at the moment, we're getting in touch now with the Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell and the leader of the SDLP, Colin Westwood. But let's go first to Labour's Rushanara Ali. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Would you expect that Greensill and David Cameron would be at the forefront of the questions from your leader, Sir Keir Starmer?
Good morning. Yes, I would hope so, given that this is a really serious matter of public confidence and public trust in how our government operates. And what we've seen in the last year is the procurement scandal, where some £2 billion of money have been contracted out to those companies and individuals with links to the Conservative Party and Conservative donors. And this case is, you know, an even bigger scandal, frankly. And, you know, people are going to be right now, quite rightly, thinking, where is our money going and why is this happening? You know, people should expect their government to have proper, appropriate stewardship of their money. And we just, you know, what we've seen in the last year is scandal after scandal. And now it seems that the former Prime Minister has been involved and government ministers. Some 12 meetings took place with various departments. So there's a major case to answer, and I do hope that is raised in Prime Minister's questions today.
Now, it does appear, though, would you accept that as far as the letter of the law and the regulations is concerned, Mr. Cameron himself has not broken them?
Well, look, the question is it right for anyone, government ministers, former government ministers or former prime ministers, to be lobbying in this way for personal profit, it seems here? And there's certainly a case for tightening up the law to make sure that these kinds of scandals don't take place and this kind of behaviour is stopped. It's not in in the public interest. And frankly, former prime ministers shouldn't be in the business of lobbying ministers for the companies that they go on to work for. And there's certainly a case for increasing the number of years at the very least, and potentially, you know, making sure that former prime ministers don't get engaged in this sort of activity. This is, you know, this brings into disrepute the office of prime minister, even if a prime minister, even if he or she is no longer prime minister, if they take this, you know, get involved with this sort of activity.
Also joining us, Colin Eastwood, leader of Northern Ireland Social Democratic and Labour Party. Let's talk first of all about this Greensill scandal. What are the questions you think you still want answered by the Prime Minister and the government?
Well, the whole thing's quite shocking, really. It's very reminiscent of the early 90s, the Tory government, the sleaze-filled Tory government at that stage. And it's actually interesting that Boris Johnson, while resisting, I think, a proper inquiry, will have some sort of inquiry into David Cameron, but seems to have resisted any kind of transparency around COVID contracts and the billions of pounds that have clearly been wasted around test and trace and other things. This government doesn't know or doesn't understand the word transparency, and I think it is many people out there will be absolutely disgusted as to what has seemingly happened with David Cameron, with Rishi Sunak, with Greensill and all of the other people involved in this. And I think we need a proper, full inquiry into all of this, or else the public won't be satisfied.
The nature of that inquiry be? Because clearly there is an inquiry of sorts underway under a lawyer. What sort of inquiry would you like to see, Colin Eastwood?
Well, I know there's a proposal from the Labour Party today for a parliamentary inquiry. We will support that. I think anything set up by Boris Johnson, frankly, with having a lawyer looking into it, we've seen that before in Northern Ireland. I don't think it'll be enough. I don't think it'll satisfy the public, because what we really need to find out is how deep this goes, how much of a web of, frankly, corruption has been within the British establishment at the very top. It's important that we understand everything that went on, and there can't be a kind of a whitewash in this. There has to be a proper inquiry that we can all have confidence in.
And Rushanara, of course, since the resignation of Alex Allen over the Priti Patel report, we don't even have a senior person invigilating the government in Whitehall. I mean, is that acceptable, or should there, simply be statutory that you couldn't have a vacancy in that post?
Well, it's completely unacceptable, and it just goes to show why no one trusts the process, and why this inquiry that the government has announced is going to, frankly, fall short because it's not independent. And the government has consistently undermined efforts to ensure our system is transparent, that no one's above the law. In fact, this government continues to proudly break the law. And so what we need is to restore trust. And the way to do that is to strengthen the law, to protect public money, to protect our civil service from outside influence and the risk of corruption. And, we have one of the best civil services in the world, but what we're seeing is the contamination through political favours, through the use of the old boys network, which is rampant now. And what we're seeing is that there's a brazen effort to profit from government contracts and profit from networks and connections. And this has got to stop. And the best way to do that is to make sure that the right people are independent individuals are placed in those positions, and that the law is strengthened to protect the public purse, to protect the reputation and integrity of government and our civil service.
Mr. Eastwood, does it grate with you that there's so much concentration on this sort of Westminster scandal in the media as well, and rather less focus on the very serious unrest which we've seen in recent days on the streets of Northern Ireland?
Well, I think it's absolutely right that there is proper focus on what is going on at the heart of this Tory government, and seemingly every Tory government that we've seen in the last number of decades. But I do think it is quite frustrating at times when we've had, thankfully, some calmness over the last number of nights, but when we had 8 or 9 days of violence on the streets of Northern Ireland, much of it brought about, frankly, by the dishonesty of the British government and the way in which Boris Johnson and the Secretary of State have spoken to the unionist community and pretended that there wasn't going to be a border down the Irish Sea. That has made it a lot of this a lot worse, and has created a sense of loss and confusion within that community, and there has been a real lack of honesty in that conversation. So yes, I do think it is frustrating to not see as much focus put on not necessarily the violence, but how we can resolve the difficulties that exist within the political process in Northern Ireland.
I mean, Rushanara, what do you think the government should be doing now about the unrest in Northern Ireland? Because clearly it hasn't been given a major priority by the Prime Minister. He hasn't visited it, or, as far as we know, called in senior officials or contacted the Irish. What do you think he should be doing?
Well, it's deeply, deeply concerning. And as Callum says, I mean, this is hard-won peace. My party in government, with so many others, and all our partners in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, worked together, and the international community, particularly the US, joined in securing that hard-won peace. And what we see is a government squandering that peace. There's a lack of leadership at the heart of Downing Street, at the heart of our government. What we need is the government to step up and bring the different parties together to try and bring an end to what is a very worrying situation. Callum's absolutely right that of course there are underlying factors such as the impact of the trade agreement that has been agreed and the disruption to supplies and all the other issues that have arisen out of Brexit. But, with Northern Ireland, we know, that you have to keep working at it. As a nation, we all have to keep working at it. Successive governments need to keep working at building on the peace agreement that was agreed. And what we're seeing is this government neglecting that very important responsibility.
Ms Risa, what are the questions on Northern Ireland that you would like the Prime Minister to be asked at Prime Minister's Questions coming up?
Well, of course, Boris Johnson has been invisible during all of this, and I think that says an awful lot. What we've asked for is that the government recognises that this is a crisis in our peace process. Brandon Lewis yesterday told me in the House of Commons that policing is a devolved issue. It is, but peace isn't a devolved issue, and we need all of the government agencies involved in trying to resolve it. And the Good Friday Agreement allows for that. We have something called the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which could be called to begin to deal with all of these issues. I think when two governments step away from this process, we end up having difficulties on the streets, and that is clearly what's happened. So I think there's a massive job of work to be done by the government to bring all the parties together, to talk to the Irish government properly in a structured way, to work through the difficult issues. That's the only way we've ever solved anything in Northern Ireland, and pretending it isn't happening isn't going to work.
Do you think there's any truth in what has been said since this trouble came out, that loyalists and unionists are inflamed because they think their communities are being treated unfairly compared to the nationalist communities? And obviously the question of the IRA funeral came into that. Do you think there's any truth in that?
I think that's how people feel. I don't think it's real. In fact, we have accountability structures for the police service of Northern Ireland better than any, probably around the world, and we should work through those. If people have difficulties about policing, I mean, remember, we had decades of difficulties around policing, and we had to work very hard to turn that around. If people have issues, work through the policing board, work through the accountability mechanisms and structures that are there, but don't create a political crisis, a policing crisis in the middle of a political crisis, because that can have real difficulty and dangerous implications on the streets, as we've seen.
What do you think, Rushanara? Do you think the desire to support the Belfast Agreement, which opens the way to Irish involvement in Northern Ireland, has basically gone a bit too far?
I don't think so. I think, look, the fundamentals here are that this government tends to be very neglectful of the situation in Northern Ireland, in fact cavalier about the peace process, and we saw that through the Brexit years, and we saw the dishonesty in what the Prime Minister promised and then falling short. And I think, if anything, if there's anger, it's anger towards Boris Johnson and his government for misleading people in Northern Ireland. And, you know, he was promising people the earth and not delivering. And that kind of anger potentially can, you know, as we've seen, is spilling over in the streets. But we've got to focus on how we bring an end to the violence and how we preserve what is still a fragile peace and has become more fragile because of recent events. So that's where, I mean, I think that's where the blame lies, frankly. A dishonest government treating Northern Ireland and peace, taking it for granted, actually, and treating it without care. And that's deeply concerning.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. And I should say apologies to the Conservatives and particularly to Andrew Mitchell MP. I'm afraid we had some technical difficulties reaching him, but very grateful for those comments from the other two MPs.